Добрий вечір всім. Мене звати Шон Охара. Я аташе з питань культури і освіти в американському посольстві. Я нещодавно вивчав українську мову 9 місяців в Америці, щоб я зміг тут стояти і сказати вам доброго дня. Мене звати Шон Охара. Я з американського посольства. І ласкаво просимо в американський дім. Now in English, if you don't mind. Thank you very much. It's great to see a full house here. And I'm delighted. My job today is simply to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Richard Weitz from the Hudson Institute. Thank you so much for being here. And to get to pass along some insights on American foreign policy. You know, we regularly sponsor American speakers to come to Ukraine to talk about various issues, foreign policy, information, media, culture. And we do this program because, in addition to hearing from diplomats and from those of us who work in the American government, we want you to hear from some independent voices. So, as Dr. Weitz will remind you, his opinions are his own. He's not working in the government, not representing the government. So, but he is an expert in his field, and we're very happy he's here to share insights and to give you some context of our American policy and also to take your questions. So with that, please help me welcome Dr. Richard Weitz.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Are we okay with the mic? Everything's fine? Okay. So I want to thank the U.S. Embassy for sponsoring me on the visit. I want to thank the Institute for World Policy for organizing a really terrific program. I got to meet with students on Monday. We spent the day seeing Kiev. I got to spend then the next 2 days meeting with opinion leaders, people in the national security field, government officials. And for me, this was primarily a learning trip. I'm not an expert in Ukraine. The last time I was here, it was 1986. Я понимаю по-русски, but when I was going to school, they said, you know, you only need to know Russian, you don't need to know Ukrainian or Kazakh, whatever. Luckily, Scott's generation, my students understand that's not the correct approach, but it's too late for me, but we have people who are learning Ukrainian. I want to also thank the MacArthur Foundation for supporting my general research on what I'm going to talk about. And that is, to be specific, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Russia-China U.S. triangle and some of the dynamics we've seen, particularly in the last 6 months. I'll then focus a bit on the Russia-U.S. relationship in a bit more detail. Touch on Ukraine, but more just the general framework. I talked for about maybe 7-8 minutes, and then what I'm really eager to do is transition to hearing your questions, but also comments. You're welcome to make statements in whatever language you want, and it's good for me as a learning experience. Again, these are just my own personal views. They don't represent the U.S. government or Hudson or anybody else. And I'll bet you most of my Hudson colleagues would disagree on some of the things I'm going to say, but that's fine. It's okay where we are in Washington to do that. I'm very blessed at an institute that's pretty open-minded on these issues. I think during the election campaign, one of the things that stood out about now President, but then candidate Donald Trump, was the extent to which he was challenging some fundamental truths of U.S. foreign policy. These were, free trade, promotion of democracy as a major goal, and a series of other areas, non-proliferation. But for me, one of the interesting things was he was one of the first, a few public officials to actually talk about the Russia-China U.S. triangle and think a bit about that kind of geopolitical logic. Normally, it's not something that reached that kind of high-level discourse. And one of his criticisms of the President Obama's foreign policy was he felt that the previous administration had been too confrontational with Russia and China simultaneously, and that effect was basically driving them together against the U.S. And putting the U.S. in a geopolitically disadvantaged position. And so in the course of the campaign and the transition, there were people who appeared to have some influence with the administration. It was never clear how authoritative their views were, but there was a lot of talk about how you could reverse this fact that the U.S. was basically the outlier in the strategic triangle. And in particular, there was a lot of discussion about the necessity of reconciling and addressing some of the differences that separated Russia and the United States, and basically try and pull Russia away from China. There was never a thought that you could basically cause Russia to switch to align with the U.S. against China, but there was a hope that you could perhaps reduce Russian ties with China, supplying military equipment, supporting China's ambitions in various parts of the world, and so on. This also was the case with Iran. There was a lot of concern about Russian-Iranian ties and what the U.S. needed to do to pull Russia away from Iran. And then there was a discussion. They raised some issues about how you could reconcile Russia and the U.S. And they started from the fundamental proposition, which I actually do believe, is that the Russia-U.S. relationship is worse than it should be, objectively speaking. And then they tried to identify what were the sources of differences between Russia and the U.S., some of which they recognized were irreconcilable, but others they thought they could address. I mean, for example, they thought it would be better for the U.S. to intervene less directly in Russian domestic affairs, since this was producing the obverse results of what they hoped to achieve. It was contributing to Russian distrust of the United States and apparently not doing much for the opposition. And there was a talk about geopolitical bargains, perhaps working with Russia more in Syria, accepting the presidency of Assad in return for Russia taking a more active role in fighting ISIS. There was some discussion of Eurasia directly. Trump made some statements that were never actually carried out, but he made some statements that he would look at the question of Crimea, for example, maybe think of a new approach that would address that helped achieve a settlement there. There wasn't much discussion of Eastern Ukraine, but it raised a lot of interest. There was also, of course, statements on thinking about how to restructure NATO. And the effect of this was interesting. In China, the Chinese, actually, strategic leaders do think about this triangle a lot. It seems to be an important thinking about Chinese foreign policy. And you saw some concern about how this would play itself out. I mean, clearly there was more concern about some of the more directly anti-China statements that the president-elect was making during his campaign, focusing on Chinese trade, but also then there was a discussion called the Taiwanese president, and some other steps that were concerning the Chinese. But they were also a little bit worried about what might happen with Russia. They've had some experiences that they were concerned about in the past. I mean, there was some evidence that China was ready to back Russia in a missile defense question, for example, at the time the U.S. withdrew from the ABM treaty about 2001, but then Putin went ahead and accepted a deal, and so the Chinese felt they were a little worried they were going to see more Russian defections. But it didn't seem to alarm them too much. I mean, I think they felt that their ties with Russia were solid enough, and even if they lost Russian support more overtly, they don't really need Russian energy if they could get it from other sources. They have UN veto power. They don't really need Russian arms the way they did in the past. They can produce a lot domestically. So the extent of alarm was never clear. But as we know, it became a non-issue. When the administration came in, it became much more focused about Korea. There was a good meeting between President Xi and President Trump in Florida, and so the Chinese concern about the triangle rapidly faded. Now, the Russian position was a little more interesting because you saw a lot of Russian enthusiasm for Trump, thinking that finally Russia will find itself in the very advantageous position of being between China and the United States, and this would allow Russia to bargain for advantages with both powers and increase its leverage. They already thought that China was going to need their help for the Silk Road initiative because of their influence in Central Asia and elsewhere in Eurasia. But they also were hoping that if they could gain some leverage with the U.S., if the U.S. was going to try and reconcile with Russia. This, of course, manifested itself more directly in Russian interest in Trump. And if you read some of the writings about Trump and was a lot of very visible enthusiasm for him as some kind of decisive leader, someone who you could bargain with, someone who was going to focus in on advancing very narrowly defined nationalist U.S. interests, which did not include regime change or colored revolutions, as whatever the term the Russians would want to use for that, focused more on what specific gains the U.S. could make on terrorism or perhaps gaining U.S. investment. There was discussion on the U.S. side. I'm not sure how much Russians thought this might occur, but a discussion about what sanctions might be relaxed. As you know, there are a variety of U.S. sanctions on Russia, and they primarily relate to Ukraine, but they cover different areas. And so there's some speculation you would keep the sanctions on Crimea, but perhaps tinker with the other ones on the entities and the financial and other sectors. But there was doubt in Russia and the U.S. about whether whether it really mattered who was elected president, even if Trump came in and he tried to change U.S. policies in a way that would try and affect this triangle would occur. We've seen this big cycle in Russia-U.S. relations over time. It really has gone up and down. We've seen the Cold War effort at partnership, then deterioration over NATO's growth in the Georgia War, then some reconciliation, and of course now since the Russian annexation of Crimea and activities in eastern Ukraine, sharp deterioration. Even early on in Trump, there was a lot of Russian concern about some of the people that were being appointed to positions. They liked Flynn, but they were concerned about some of the other people who were appointed, particularly in the Defense Department and in some other places. As you know, the conditions that would allow for a broad Russian-U.S. reconciliation have disappeared, and I think everyone recognizes that in Russia and the United States for factors within the United States and other considerations. The relationship with China, it could go a lot worse. At the moment, the Chinese are still kind of cautious in how they approach Trump. So a lot of things Trump's done that in the past would have triggered a very sharp reaction, severance of military dialogue and so on, such as U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, threats to sanction Chinese businesses, threats to challenge trade agreements. In the past, the Chinese would have acted much more aggressively. They have not so far in the case of Trump. I still think they're a bit trying to figure out precisely what he's planning to do with China and what his goals are and what they can expect. But I could easily see that relationship deteriorating. So where we are now is we're sort of where we've been in the last few years, which is the U.S. on the outside of this triangle. Russia and China have always objected to U.S. policies. What's changed now is their capacity to challenge them are greater. So Russia's pursuing a much more assertive policy in the former Soviet Union, and in the Middle East in particular, you see a radical break in terms of sending actual combat forces to Syria and so on. And China has become much more assertive about stating its territorial claims, demanding the U.S. ends its military freedom of operation navigation operations near China and other activities. And I don't see any major driver at the moment that would change things. Certainly the Russia-U.S. relationship, unless there's a major change in Ukraine and not only there, but at least in Ukraine, I don't see any changes in U.S. sanctions. I don't see that Trump administration would have any room to pursue Russia reconciliation, even if he wanted to. The one factor that might change near term would be if, following Putin's re-election next year, which I'm anticipating, he is in a much, we've had the experiment with a change of power in the U.S., a pro-Russian person coming into the U.S. Administration, and a failed effort of reconciliation. What we're waiting for now, seeing as a social scientist, you have a change in government in Russia, you get a new Russian leader. Would that perhaps lead to overcome some of the barriers we've seen in the past? And one of these is, I think, President Putin's view of the United States. I mean, he's a very smart person and he understands a lot, but he has a lot of misconceptions about how U.S. foreign policy works, U.S. objectives in the former Soviet Union, and I can't see anything the U.S. can do now that would change these. So it would have to take a different Russian leader who would come in and have a different mindset and view of the U.S. and an understanding of how Russia might benefit from making what they would see as concessions in the Eurasia space, Ukraine, Georgia, perhaps elsewhere, in return for longer-term benefits for Russia's domestic and foreign political development. Longer term, there's still this mystery why Russia hasn't followed what we're all taught in school is supposed to happen in geopolitics. Russia is facing a rising China. I mean, all the trends show that China is going to surpass and continue to widen the gap with Russia in terms of population, GDP, and soon perhaps military power, except perhaps in the nuclear sphere, which is a bit different. And so logic would tell you that the Russian strategists would try and move closer to the U.S., even making some concessions in an effort to deal with what would, because of geographic proximity and Chinese past differences, is going to be a really serious challenge for Russian security in the long term. But so far, and I think it's genuine, the Russian strategists say they do not see a near-term threat from China. They think that they are still in a stronger position in terms of military technology development. They think that the Chinese are focused on resolving their differences with India, with Vietnam, with Japan, the United States, but not Russia. And as long as China is involved in all these other conflicts, the Chinese would not want to open a second front against Russia, trying to press claims against Russia or the Eurasian powers. And the same Russia at the moment thinks it would be disadvantaged for us to take actions that would lead them into conflict with China because they're already have such difficult relations with the Western powers and others. But a lot of this is a bit of speculation and a bit of my own interpretation of recent events. So I'd like to hear what people who, like yourself, who are much closer to the situation, have a much better understanding of Eurasian dynamics think. So I welcome your questions, comments, zamechania, whatever you want. So who calls on the questions? Okay, go.
Thank you very much. It's just my consideration that I come from Italy, I come from Europe, and in all your speak about geopolitics, you never named Europe once.
Right.
So yes, it means that probably in all these chess game, Europe is not being considered at all. That's my first consideration. The second one is that yes, Russia is scared about the enlargement of China. I heard that they are, for example, giving land plots in the far east of Russia to Russian in order to stop the invasion of many Chinese people coming in Siberia and coming to live there. But also, I think he is Russia is quite scared about the enlargement of NATO, because there are many new NATO members, even nearer the Russian border, and I think this scared Russia very much.
Yeah, the Euro point's a good one. I mean, it would have become more of a factor if the Trump administration had pursued some of the policies that we thought might have come out when it assumed office based on the president's statements during the election campaign and periodically thereafter. If he had shown more aggressively questioned the U.S. security alignments in NATO, if he had basically taken steps to weaken NATO, if he had more directly confronted the EU, as some of his policies said, then I think Europe would have been more at play. Particularly Russia would see itself having a European option to bolster its strength, aligning with Europe in some way to help it deal with both China and the United States. But so far the administration has not done that, and the NATO alliance seems strong. The EU, of course, is more questionable. But the reason I wasn't focused on it is because in one of Putin's misperceptions is that he seems to think that the U.S. controls Europe, and at times he likes to try and find a Berlusconi or a Schroeder or somebody he can do business with. But he seems to think that among the European leaders, they're less of enticing than Trump. Maybe that will change, but Merkel will go there and right in the Moscow press conference chew him out for what's happening in Ukraine and Chechnya, human rights. He doesn't have to listen to that when he meets with Trump. And so I think that at least so far, the Russian strategists, they think long-term there could be a Russia-EU reconciliation. I mean, I think their vision of a Eurasia a bloc in which Russia is able to improve its relations with China, serve as a main transit zone, revitalize its economy, change its economy, will in the end make it a more attractive partner for Europe. And particularly if they think that the Europeans, as they're trying to push, are uncomfortable with American values or American policy. But for now, I don't see the Russians seeing Europe as much of a potential threat or opportunity as the United States. And the Chinese, of course, it's a bit different. It's not a security issue, really, for the Chinese. There's some talk sometimes of the French and the Germans sending in, particularly the British, of sending their patrols into the Pacific for short term. And you've had a Chinese flotilla, admittedly only 3 ships, but still in the Baltic for the first time. But for the most part, the Chinese, when they talk about Europe, it's all economic and and pretty much win-win. And so, I think you're probably right. If I need to think more clearly about how Europe might evolve into this framework. And then the NATO expansion. I don't think this administration is going to push for further NATO expansion soon. I mean, they came into office, and Montenegro was already in, and it would have been a major step to try and block that. But I haven't seen a strong, even declaratory commitment to NATO membership for Georgia, Ukraine, or even in the Balkans. It's not really an immediate priority, but it is a Russian concern. But I'm not. It hasn't been There's a long list of Russian complaints I'm hearing at the moment, and NATO expansion is a complaint about prior policy, but doesn't seem to be an urgent current concern about future U.S. policy. It's more what the U.S. and NATO is doing in its current membership, particularly in terms of military activities near Russia. And then the whole general issue about Russia not having a say in a European security order it really doesn't like. A NATO-dominated security order, one based on OSCE principles and Helsinki principles, and Russia sort of on the side. They don't like that. But I think they're still struggling to think how to break that, and so it's possible, depending on how the European elections play out, they may see more of a partner. You saw some enthusiasm from Macron for a little while, but didn't work out. Germany, I think they're going to be stuck with Merkel. So, Britain, if the Labour Party wins, that might present some interesting options for Russia. But at the moment, I haven't seen that active pursuit of Europe, but that might certainly, I have to think a little more clearly the more you look out on this issue. Okay. Okay.
Yes. I have sort of follow-up on Europe. And could you please, just as independent, private, and give me a frank answer regarding Europe? And I mean, is this reply of Mrs. Nuland to Ambassador Pyatt at the time, in 2014, is still relevant, still valid?
Okay, just as a
Do you know about which reply I'm talking about?
I want to make sure I understand. Which one do you have? Which one?
No, there was some sort of conversation between Pyatt and Nuland, and Pyatt asked about European opinion, and she said, if I can repeat now, fuck the EU.
Okay. You mean that leak conversation? Yeah.
Is it still valid? Is it still relevant?
Right.
Whatever.
All right.
Because,
okay.
But please, clear and concise.
Right.
So
okay, but just as a caution to everybody, this is going to YouTube, so this is going to be out for the entire world to see. So this is not a frank, anything you say could be, will be visible to the world. So just make sure everybody understands that. That said, I'm not important enough that I worry too much about what I say and how that could, affect me. So, that certainly, I have, that opinion is still, you see that at the level of the White House. I mean, there's a clear lack of thinking that the EU is not particularly influential. It's a bit of a mess at the moment. I hear that a lot in Russia too, that, the EU is in chaos, currency, Britain withdrawal, divergences between what priorities over immigration, divisions within the European social strata. Some countries friendly to Russia, some hostile. So I think that is the general view. But Americans traditionally underestimate the EU and don't really, even I don't really understand fully all the complexities of how the EU makes policies. And I'm surprised sometimes when I think we could do something with one of the European members and then find out, no, you need the EU to approve it. So that is a common, I think that's still plain. I don't know if they would say that, the term you use, but that frame of reference is still relevant.
How prominent?
Sorry, I think he.
Microphone. We should use microphones.
Yeah. So, she's choosing the people to defect. So, raise your hand, then she'll come to you.
I'm just curious on your opinions with North Korea stirring things up between China and America, and now the first time ever Kadyrov and Muslims saying about choosing sides, which is interesting because the killings were going on for ages and they only acted right now, so everything's going on very fast and interesting. What's your opinion about all of this?
Yeah, I know Korea more because I do a lot of work on nonproliferation. And that was one of the other things we were looking to see what the Trump team would do. Because in their policy review, they considered a much wider range of options than we normally do with Korea. So some of the measures they said that were under review were, on the one hand, Trump meeting with Kim Jong-un, trying to work out a deal one-on-one, and the other, there was talk about trying to assassinate him or, put nuclear weapons and they're all, and you never, and maybe these are trial balloons, maybe this was just designed to try and put pressure on China or something. We never knew. But the current U.S. policy is very similar in Korea and in many other places, including, as far as I understand it, in Ukraine, to what we saw in the Obama administration. So in Korea, it's still the three pillars of, on the one, you rely on sanctions. You try and weaken the finances and put pressure on the North Korean elite, try and discourage other countries, particularly China, from doing business with North Korea. But there's also the diplomacy pillar that's primarily working with Japan and South Korea as U.S. allies, but also trying to reach out to China and at times Russia to try and intercede in Pyongyang. And then the military activities, there's a wider range of options under discussion, but so far the military steps have been modest improvements, deployments of more THAAD batteries, some continued exercises, some discussion about Japan and South Korea gaining offensive strike weapons, and a little talk about other military options without being explicit. But in this, what strikes me most about the Trump administration is how similar some of its policies have been to previous administrations, particularly the Obama administration, despite the rhetoric of the campaign and the wide range of options that were apparently under these reviews. With respect to Korea itself and just in general how that affects us, I still think the risks of war are low. I think North Korea is trying to become a nuclear weapon state, get a nuclear, maybe being able to put a nuclear weapons on top of missiles and launch them to the United States or anyone else they want. But I don't expect North Korea to attack the United States out of the blue. I think that they want these weapons to defend themselves and exclude an option of a U.S. attack on North Korea so that North Korea is then free to engage in other activities, such as we saw in the past, sinking South Korean warships, shelling the border islands, doing other provocations. But this time they could say, we don't need to worry about the U.S. because if you try and intervene, we'll destroy L.A. or whatever. So it's part of an offensive strategy. But it's not so much designed to attack the U.S. as just more designed to neutralize the U.S., to give North Korea more of a free hand to do what it wants regionally, which is not good because it could easily lead to miscalculations and so on.
How prominent are Ukrainian news in America news?
Right.
And what does average American knows about war in the eastern part of Ukraine? And the third question, some European radio station call them bandits, and another European station calls Russian fighters separatists supported by Russia. Question is, how does America news outlets call Russian fighters?
Okay, then again, caveat, I'm not a Ukraine expert, so but I am an average American viewer in terms of news about. So most news, as you might expect, does not address international affairs at all. In that there are exceptions, some of the more elite news, particularly in Washington, they'll focus on urgent issues such as Korea. There was a lot of focus, of course, on Ukraine in 2014. That has declined over time. I've not seen much discussion of all in the last year of Crimea. There is some discussion of eastern Ukraine whenever the ceasefire is announced, whenever it's broken. Sometimes they'll have specials. The U.S. government-supported news outlets, VOA, Radio Free Europe, you have here and you know their views. It's Russian. This is a Russian intervention in Ukraine's sovereign affairs, and these actors are supported by Russia. And basically, Russia could stop this what's happening in eastern Ukraine if Putin decides to do so. That's generally the view of the U.S. media. I mean, there are probably some exceptions, but they're not influential in the Washington debate. It's a pretty solid view that these are. I guess you could call them separatists, but they're clearly Russian-backed separatists. And if Russia were not to not interfere in Russian internal affairs, the expectation is the Ukrainian a government could easily reoccupy these territories and reintegrate them into the rest of Ukraine. So I think that's the general perception. But Ukraine itself has declined in importance as it's been displaced by Korea, Syria, and some other issues among those that follow international news.
Okay. Thanks a lot for coming. So my question is, you talked about Russia and China becoming more aggressive in recent years, about staying, minding their business, expanding their policies, What's your opinion on regards that maybe it's because of the weakening force projections by United States in recent administrations under Obama and Trump right now? So what do you think about it?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the U.S. intelligence community is having an open debate about this. On the one hand, it's somewhat natural. I mean, both Russia and China have experienced a resurgence in capabilities in recent years. So whereas under Yeltsin, the Russian government might oppose NATO expansion, but really didn't have any means to block it other than appeal to the Clinton administration not to do it. And the Chinese might claim these islands, but really didn't have a navy or anything that it could assert that control. They now have these capabilities, and they're more so that and more the will to use them. So some of it's just a natural fact that in at least military terms, Russia and China are rising. How long Russia will continue to rise is unclear, but the thinking is China will continue to do so. And the U.S. intelligence community is somewhat divided. There is the school that what you said, that they see. They don't necessarily say it's Obama seen as weak or Trump seen as weak, but they think that the U.S. is by not confronting them sufficiently is encouraging them to keep on going, and that only a really firm stance, telling Putin get out of Ukraine or blank, or putting the U.S. carrier base right on the Philippines or something like that would stop them. Whereas another interpretation is they're sort of imitating each other. China sees Russia does this in Georgia, Russia does this in Ukraine. They're still there. It seems to have worked. Maybe we should now let's try the same kind of sort of sub-conventional hybrid tactics in China in the East China Sea. There's also a sense, as I think Trump said during the campaign, that the U.S. has been making a mistake by trying to challenge them both. It would be better if the U.S. would focus its policies against one of them, and then that would lessen the incentive for them to partner together. The problem is we don't know what's happening, but what would be the best solution? But it's a real challenge, the kind of tactics that Russia and China have been using, because if they were to openly invade Lithuania with conventional troops or seize the East China, some of the islands contested with Japan, then it would be clear act of aggression, and the U.S. could mobilize its forces, and I don't know if there'd be a war, but there'd certainly be a major confrontation. But these kind of tactics of not relying on military force, relying on skillful media manipulation or economic leverage or other means, it's harder to get a good defense against that. I think the U.S. and its partners in Europe are much better defended. So I think that it would be difficult for Russia to repeat, a Crimea-type operation in the Baltics or anything like that soon. China's more of a challenge because, at least in Europe, Russia's confronted with a pretty strong NATO alliance and a pretty solid consensus not against further Russian expansion of Russian influence. Whereas in Asia, the Asian powers are divided. Even the Indians, who are facing a lot of challenges with China, don't want to openly ally with the U.S. The Philippines, they can go back and forth, think what's advantages. The South Koreans want to focus on North Korea and don't want to get in confrontation with China. And Japan's trying to struggle with how it can maybe work out a deal with Russia to reduce the pressure it's facing from China. But it's harder for the U.S. or anyone else to rally the forces against China as opposed to what's happening in Europe. So I'm actually more worried long term about a China-U.S. confrontation than I am about a Russia-U.S. because if the Chinese wanted to, they could behave much more assertively, and it would be difficult for the U.S. to, at least at the present, to stop them.
Okay, hi Richard, thank you very much for coming, and I have one question to you, which has been a concern for me for quite a lot of time. In 1996, recently I read one very interesting book, which was written by very famous geostrategist, geopolitician, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who unfortunately recently has passed away. And the book is called Grand Chessboard. I'm sure much of the audience here is pretty familiar with the book. And this book was published, as far as I remember, in the midst of the crisis in Yugoslavia, when there was a major conflict unfolding in Yugoslavia. And at that time, which was more than 20 years ago, this genius of a man, which I believe, and I'm sure Zbigniew Brzezinski is because he was advisor of President Henry Kissinger, and he was the one mainly responsible for the orchestration of many military conflicts in Afghanistan, and he took very major part in the denunciation and dissolution of the Soviet Union. And he, in this book, he mentioned that there would be a very big power struggle between the triangle, which you mentioned, between US, China, and Russia. And he even mentioned Ukraine in the 1996 book, this Grand Chessboard. He said that Ukraine would be used as a major tool to further the geopolitical agenda of both Russia, US, and China, which is meaning that we are just a spare part on this table, right? To further and to strengthen the agenda of this big nation. This is the first thing which I would like to ask you. The first thing about what's your opinion on these claims which were stipulated in this book, which was written around 20 years ago, because I'm quite wondering how this person could have predicted these events which are unfolding right now on the global scene around 20 years ago. And the second thing which I would like to ask you is that he also mentioned that China is eventually going to become the biggest player of this triangle, because right now, as you see, the China economy is growing exponentially, and in terms of GDP and in terms of trade exports to United States, and in terms of global economy, the China is taking second place after the United States. And as you know, the majority of US companies are holding production which is outsourced to China. Whatever gadgets we are buying, everything is, for example, most of the iPhones and gadgets, they're produced in Foxconn, which is a plant in China where most of the companies are holding production. And he said that US and China are going to have a very soft relationship, because it's absolutely to the disadvantage of US-China relationship to take any power struggle, whether economic, political, or military, against China, for reasons of what was mentioned about economic production, which is being outsourced there. And second thing, that China is holding a vast amount of US debt, which is being released by the US Treasury, the obligations, the bonds, around 5 trillion is an estimation in the excess of this amount. So what do you think about this? He mentioned that China and US would probably even form something like a cooperation, but which is going to be too extreme and devastating disadvantage to Russia. What do you think about this?
Right. A good summary, just to make clear, Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor, prolific writer, Harvard professor, sort of like on the par with Henry Kissinger, recently died, but he was very influential in office, and subsequently he very much used this kind of geopolitical framework that I was using. And he basically said, looked at the world as this grand chessboard, a particular role between Russia, China, and the US. He did make a very important statement, which is still very relevant, that as long as Ukraine is kept independent from Russia, Russia really can't be a superpower, it can't be a major threat to Europe, and that has continued to influence US policy. I mean, it's not necessarily anti-Russian to want Ukraine to be independent, but it does help the European balance of power a lot. That you have a, that you have a physical barrier and an independent liberal democratic Ukraine to serve as a counterweight to what could be a much more serious Russian threat were it not for the separation. The second part is actually very interesting about when he talks about the role of China and the U.S. And this framework has appeared again and again, and it's particularly concern of the Russians that you don't really maybe need this triangular framework. You could actually think of a G2, a bilateral, and the Obama administration sometimes, at least initially, talked about this. And the idea is, Russia and the U.S., it's a somewhat stable, constrained relationship because we have mutual assured destruction, right? We could destroy each other if we wanted to. With China and U.S., you have that, but even more importantly, you have this kind of mutual assured depression that if we went to conflict, it would basically destroy both our economies because we're so independent. And that's what's unfortunately lacking in the Russia-U.S. relationship. That in the China-U.S. relationship, when Russia-U.S., the kind of issues I talk about are the same I've been talking about for the last 30 years. Arms control, regional security. In the China-U.S. relationship, it's a much richer, much more networked relationship. A lot of ballast, if you will, is such in the ship. So we have extensive economic ties, academic ties. I have, there are lots of Chinese students come to the U.S. The president of China's daughter studied at a U.S. university. We have, our economies are so interdependent that that's a natural break on the level of confrontation that we would productively occur. Because you're right, if the Chinese were to basically pull out all their investment and all cooperation in the U.S., it would be a devastating blow to the U.S. economy. Conversely, if the U.S. Wall Street were to disappear, the U.S. were to disappear, China would find it really difficult to manage, at least for a while. And so that's the challenge we have in the Russia-U.S. relationship. And unfortunately, we've been going in the wrong direction, right? We've been cutting back on our diplomatic exchanges, academic exchanges. I think it's mostly Russia's fault this is occurring, but they're limiting access to U.S. NGOs in Russia. And the sanctions rule out much of the economic partnership. So we're doomed to this kind of bipolar Cold War framework in which we count how many missiles we have, how many tanks, what kind of regional security cooperation we'll see in Syria or Ukraine. Whereas China is just much more rich and complex, but it's also more complicated. It takes a genius like Brzezinski to sort it out. But I'm glad you mentioned his book, and he's written, and that's a good book for many of us to read. Sure.
Let's finish with this part, and then I will go.
Okay. One quick question. I'm interested in how North Korea's recent aggressive gestures and rocket launches is affecting Russian-Chinese relations at the moment. It seems that China's under increasing pressure to cut off energy resources and exports to North Korea. But at the same time, if they do this, ultimately, I believe that Russia might begin supplying similar resources to the DPRK. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, that whole dynamic is really interesting, how Russia and China have been relating to Korea. To take the Russian example, when the new Russian government came into power in the 1991, early 90s, one of their first steps was to cut back relations with North Korea. They stopped subsidizing the economy. They saw it a bit as a pariah. They tried to move closer to South Korea, and that strategy turned out to be really ineffective. They had no influence in North Korea. They had no influence in South Korea. Putin came in and reversed this. He's been particularly interested in North Korea. He went to North Korea on several occasions. He tried to work out an earlier missile deal. He offered them access to the Russian space program if they stopped testing missiles. More recently, he's tried to get Kim Jong-un to come to Moscow. And this strategy of building ties with North Korea including possible economic interaction, has helped Russia a lot gain influence in South Korea too, because now South Korea sees Russia as a player. And the North Korean government is particularly anti-Chinese for whatever reason. The Kim Jong-un does not like China, and so he sees Russia as preferred partner. But the current situation is as you described. For a while, we were hoping that at least China would understand that they would be better off with a unified Korea that looked like what you now have in South Korea, rather than what you have now, this bizarre communist monarchy engaging in provocations on the north of China. And clearly both Russia and China, I think, would prefer if North Korea did not have nuclear weapons, were not testing missiles, because what the effect of this has been so far is just to increase the number of U.S. forces that are approaching their borders. It's stirring Japanese rearmament, and South Korea itself is moving closer to the U.S. But at the moment, what's happened is they both see North Korea as they prefer what they have now to what could happen if the North Korean government were to collapse. I mean, the scenarios range from a big civil war and mess on their borders to the U.S. Army moving up against both their borders by occupying North Korea. And so their preferred outcome as was proposed in the UN Security Council a few days ago and blocked by the U.S. is this freeze for freeze, which would solve the Korean crisis for a while, but really advantages their security, which is North Korea stops testing missiles, stops testing nuclear weapons, U.S. cuts back or ends exercises South Korea, and eventually the hope is this would unravel the South Korean-U.S. alliance, and it would give them a much more better security situation. But there is this concern, and it's been voiced by the UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, that if the Chinese cut back on their economic engagement with North Korea, that Russia will backfill. I don't know how that's going to translate, but it's basically that the Russian firms are going to move in and take advantage and just occupy the same space, because they've been trying, though not yet successfully, to build up their economic ties with North Korea. And so any sanctions we have to make sure they're enforced by both China and Russia, whether that be in energy or anything else. And that's not clear. I mean, Putin is beginning to take a harder line against the U.S. and North Korea than in the past. Possibly this disappointment with Trump's administration possibly sees an opportunity to reestablish Russia as a major player in the Pacific by exploiting this crisis. So it's turning into a real challenge.
Thank you for your comments, for providing your insight. My name is Alexander. I fully agree with you about your concern with regard to U.S. and China relationship, but I would argue that this is not so good situation in Europe, because Russia, you mentioned NATO. This is a pretty solid organization, but this is a military and political alliance. But you didn't mention European Union, so this is mostly economic organization. And Russia, using whole time approach, tries to weaken not entire organization as EU is, but some members of European Union and nation aspirants as well, using some economic and so forth elements of national power. In this regard, I think this experience should be helpful for the United States to concern about another international organization, which is ASEAN, in Asia, because China tries to weaken this organization by influencing separate countries. So what do you think about that, and do you see an analogy between these
Right.
sort of concerns.
Yes, that's a really good, and again, I stand corrected for my mistake for not talking about Europe sufficiently when I started. The feeling, I mean, it looks like Russia, the challenge of Russia's ability to influence European elections, Europe has been turned. It's on the downturn. It's not, whatever success they've had has not been enduring. You know, what happened in France, what happened in some of the East European countries, there were some gains, but it's not clear how much Russia itself had an impact. And it hasn't resulted clearly in any net benefits to Russia from whatever. There are a lot of challenges in Europe, but they seem to be independent of Russia, such as, you know, the UK voting to leave, which is a real challenge, I think, to the EU going forward. The migration challenge, it's, you know, nothing related to Russia, a lot related to but it's still a major challenge for the EU. Economically, I don't know enough about the economic situation in the EU. I do know it's still a challenge for some countries. But Russia and the U.S. don't really play that much. It's not clear to me that anything Russia and the U.S. do. I know the Russians are really upset that they didn't get an association agreement and Ukraine got one, for example, even though they've been and visa-free, you know, the visa-free, they've been pushing for that for years. I remember Lavrov telling us like 10 years ago how upset he was that his son has to get a visa to go back to school and wherever it was in Europe and so on. But I think that that concern is at least from Mao has peaked. But China and ASEAN is a real problem. The Obama administration made a strong push to develop U.S. ties with ASEAN. First U.S. ambassador to ASEAN. They started going to meetings. You know, before the U.S. never would send a high-level person to an ASEAN meeting. Then under Obama they made sure to do that. Expand U.S. military and other ties, trade, economic opportunities, and it worked well. But recently that alignment has shattered because of China cleverly working with ties with the Philippines, for example, Malaysia. I mean, fundamentally, that was what I alluded to earlier. There's a difference in that in Europe, even governments which are not overtly hostile to Russia are still concerned about Russian influence. So there's not a problem getting a NATO consensus, even though there's so many members, to have military exercises and build up the strength to protect Europe against eventualities dealing with Russia. In ASEAN, most of those countries don't want to get into conflict with China. They want to make sure the U.S. is there. They don't like a power vacuum, which they worry was occurring under the Bush administration for a while. But they don't want to sign on, for example, for a Trump-led campaign to fight China economically or whatever. So it's not a military alliance, as you mentioned. There's no military counterweight. So it's a much more challenging geopolitical environment for the United States and Europe to work in Asia than it is, I think, in Europe.
First of all, welcome to Ukraine. Well, it's a pleasure having you here tonight. Well, my question is going to be about Ukraine, and I'm sorry in advance if you're going to find it a bit too speculative. So the question is, can you imagine such a scenario where U.S. would take any kind of military action against Russian Federation over the situation in Ukraine? I mean, is there any kind of red line for Russia to cross here in Ukraine that would entail U.S. stepping in?
Right. I consider it very unlikely. And so I worry a lot about the U.S. not exaggerating its willingness to protect Ukraine against Russia. I mean, I've seen, I remember I wasn't born in Budapest 1956 occurred, but I did read about it. And there's Czechoslovakia in 1968. There's the Kurds after the war with Saddam Hussein. Georgia 2008. There are a lot of instances when, for whatever reason, the U.S. gave suggestions that, or at least the local actors involved thought the U.S. would defend them against Russia or Iraq or some other country. And then when they looked and expected that U.S. support, it did not come. And that, so I worry about what might happen in Ukraine. I don't know enough about Ukraine to know precise details, but I worry that the U.S. that the Ukrainian leadership will expect U.S. support, will take a stern act against Russia, and it won't be forthcoming. And then, and that will hurt both U.S. credibility and, more importantly, hurt Ukrainians. So I actually don't anticipate there will be U.S. military support for Ukraine, unless there is an all-out Russian invasion. And then I don't know how it would occur. I mean, the U.S. is not well positioned to come to Ukraine's defense. If there's an escalation, Russia has the military advantages. Maybe U.S. military could liberate Ukraine later, 10 years of occupation, but you don't want to go through that. So, I worry about that a lot, because it's in this debate about what kind of weaponry you want to give Ukraine, what kind of we want a NATO membership. And I just, that's I think an argument against both, although most of the opinion in Washington, certainly here, is in favor of providing Ukraine the weaponry it wants and NATO membership. The counter arguments, I've heard some of them I don't find credible, but I do worry about the risk of the U.S. Encouraging Ukrainians to die to the last Ukrainian, but not coming to Ukraine's defense. I mean, that's just my reading of history, and it's certainly not an official view, but I do worry about that a lot.
Well, since we have started talking about bad things happening, let's continue. In Ukrainian media, there is this recurring view that President Trump would very much like to make a deal, a big, beautiful deal, as he says it, with Russia, but he cannot do so currently because of all the scandals, investigations of his possible ties with Russia. But say something happens, say some kind of opposition leader becomes a nominal president in Russia, some pseudo-democratic changes, would that be sufficient for President Trump to say, okay, we're now dealing with new Russia, let's deal, and then some kind of very different foreign policy shift on Russia can happen. So whether that can happen at all, and what kind of event would possibly prompt that? That's my question.
Yeah, that's a good one. As I said, one of the odd things that President Trump said during the campaign was his very favorable views on Putin and interest in reducing and seeing the conflict with Russia as unnecessary, basically, seeing it as excessive and something that he would like to try and address. Now, he himself has backed off from that. I haven't heard talk in several months by anybody in the administration about a grand deal or even a small deal with Russia. There's not much support in Ukraine for such, to say it as an understatement. There's not much support in Europe, and that Congress is strongly against any concessions for Russia at the moment, particularly because of the Russian intervention in the U.S. elections. And although I think President Trump would like to get along better with Russia, and he doesn't appear to be hostile to Russia in his views or his views of Putin, I think that he understands he doesn't have he can't. There's no support for that deal locally or in the U.S., and even if he wanted to, say, well, you can have Ukraine, but give back Donbass, and we will promise no further NATO expansion, but then you stop giving weapons to Iran and China. I mean, you can come up with all these, but they couldn't stick. There's no way that the U.S. Congress would support such a deal. If there was a change in government in Russia, I mean, this is the kind of strange paradox we're in, that if a government in Russia threatens Ukraine, if Ukraine's in danger, and it needs NATO membership to balance, it won't get it because it's too risky, right? But if Russia-Ukraine relations are good, you've got a very nice, a Russian leader who wants to build genuine partnership with Ukraine and the West, then you can have a unity in Ukraine. It may be NATO membership because you don't need it. There's no costs involved. So it depends on if the deal, there wouldn't be an incentive to make a deal at Ukraine's expense if there was because the right leader wouldn't ask for that, right? I mean, the kind of leader that would be more popular in the West would be sufficient to generate concessions in the sense of not kind of just repeal of sanctions and a better relationship with the West, wouldn't be someone who would want parts of Ukraine under Russian control, or demand no NATO membership for Ukraine. So that's the puzzle. If it's someone just like Putin, or worse, some nationalist who really is committed to the revival of a strong, greater Russian proto-Soviet Union, then it would be even less likely.
Well, thank you for your answers, and my question will be the following. How do you see the Russian-Chinese relationship in terms of the Silk Road initiative? Should we expect any worsening? Because, as we know, the initiative involves greatly such states as Kazakhstan, which are really important for Russia, or will it be rather a mutual benefit situation?
Yeah. This is one of the mistakes I and others made at the end of the Cold War. We thought, okay, Russia, China, Russia's weaker, China's stronger. Central Asia, very important to Russia, now somewhat free. China's moving in. Okay, so therefore, Central Asia will become a natural region of rivalry between Russia and China, right? They're going to compete for influence. It hasn't occurred. That area has generally been the area where they cooperate best, at least not coming into conflict. That started with at the end of the Cold War when they had some demilitarization agreements, and then there was the Shanghai Five presidential meetings, and then it turned the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And they share a lot of common goals against Islamic extremism, limits on U.S. influence in the region, or perhaps other Western powers, support for existing governments against stability, and so on. The Silk Road is interesting. There was some indication that the reason why the Russians originally were pushing the Eurasian Union was to limit Chinese influence in Kazakhstan, and particularly Kazakhstan. That would seem to be the main area of concern, since Turkmenistan was out of their control and Uzbekistan was under Karimov, was so fiercely independent they weren't really concerned that that they couldn't control him, but neither could China. Because of the way their confrontation with the West has evolved, I think the Russian leadership has decided, okay, we don't have enough economic influence to control Central Asia the way we did in the Soviet period. So it's better that China come in and take the leading role rather than any other alternative. And the Chinese have been very clever about how they've been increasing their influence. They're very in public. They don't confront Russia at all. They talk about win-win cooperation. The Central Asians have been clever too. Whenever the Kazakhs have like an oil energy deal or something, they make sure that Lukoil or some Russian company gets 10%, so that somebody in Russia is getting money, so that there's support for the project, even if it's primarily a Western or a Chinese energy consortium. The Chinese have been very cautious about the security role they play in Central Asia. But the Silk Roads, they profess that they will harmonize them. I don't know if that will occur in reality, but the Russians seem to think this actually gives them a little leverage against China, which they've been lacking, because they they need Russian cooperation to build the kind of transcontinental connections to Europe through Central Asia or Russia or any of those territories. But there is a long-term challenge in that right now the Chinese are comfortable relying on Russia to provide their security of Central Asia. You know, they think that the Russian military and other tools can prevent the spread of too much instability. But if Russia were unable to perform that role, if ISIS were to spread, if the Uyghur communities were able to gain some military support in whatever happened in Central Asia, they would be really cross-pressured because of their growing economic role there to actually reverse their policy as they've done in other cases and take them. They never had aircraft carriers before. Now they're doing it. They build these artificial islands. I think they would feel pressured to actually take a stronger security role in Central Asia to protect their economic and security interests, and that I think would trigger a Russian alarm. But for now, they seem to be getting along well enough in Central Asia that the Russians are comfortable with the Eurasian Silk Road project as something that would yield them economic and possibly security benefits for at least for a while. And they're not really strong enough to block it anyway. So and they might as well accept it and cheer with a big smile and cheerful and say, we support it.
Hello, good evening. Thank you very much for coming to Kiev. I hope you like your stay here. You have previously mentioned that there are no big reasons for U.S.-Russia relations to change unless something major happens, possibly some change in Ukraine or Russian domestic policy. Well, recently, Russia made a big step in connecting occupied Crimea to mainland Russia by constructing the segment of a bridge. The bridge is a major threat to international maritime trade, as it blocks access to many ports in the Sea of Azov. So U.S. in response threatened to send some of its navy into the region. Last time it happened was during 2008 Russian invasion to Georgia, which is actually speculated to be one of the factors that made Russia leave most of Georgia, excluding South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So my question is, may construction of this Crimea-Russia bridge may be one of those tipping points that will change the policy of Russia towards the U.S. and vice versa, and how will it change?
Right. At present, it hasn't been a major issue in the relationship. I mean, people are aware of the bridge. They're aware that there was a bridge, and then it collapsed, and now there's going to be maybe a new bridge. And there's, people are aware that if you're in Crimea, the human rights and other situations deteriorated a lot. But it's not something that's been a priority for the Russia-U.S. Relationship. Even the militarization of Crimea, or Russian threats to put nuclear weapons into Crimea, hasn't triggered the kind of alarm that you're seeing, for example, with the Zapad 217 exercise, or concern you have about what's happening in Donetsk and in eastern Ukraine. I'm not totally sure why. I think it's possible that that President Trump it's not a priority for him and Crimea, and so the U.S. has been. It just hasn't been a. I don't think it's going to be a tipping point. I think it would have to be something like Russian annexation of DNR, LNR, or something a more visible, a more higher priority threat to U.S. goals in the West. But I could be wrong. Again, I don't know that much about Ukraine, so you're sort of pushing me in an area. I'm not sure that I could easily be corrected. Let's put it that way.
After the 2016 elections in the United States, in mainstream media of the United States, there was a huge discussion about possibly Russian influence on the elections, and I'd like to know your thoughts on it, and do you see any true background in that story?
Right. I mean, the problem with this issue and a lot of these are that the people who know can't talk about it, because this is sensitive information, and you might get media leaks, but you can't get any authoritative statement. So that means the people like me who can talk about it don't really know exactly what happened. So, but I have to believe if the U.S. intelligence community was so unanimously warning about Russian intervention, even in the context of telling a president who didn't want to hear this message that this occurred, because it's naturally you don't want to hear that Russia played a role in your election or any foreign country, that it had to have occurred, but whether it influenced the outcome is what people aren't really sure about, because Clinton won a majority of votes, so it would have had to have affected some of the states that gave Trump an electoral majority. And they're just it's what a social scientist would say, they're just conflating factors. I mean, there's so many reasons why Trump might have won. If you pulled out any Russian interference, would that have changed the outcome? And we don't know. Most people say not. Most people think, either Clinton ran a poor campaign or Trump had a peculiar message that resonated with the American voter, or this sort of nationalist, populist rhetoric. So I have to believe that it occurred, and I think Russia had good reasons to want to influence the election, because Trump's positions were more something Russia would prefer to have had taken effect than those of Clinton. And it certainly has capabilities to try and influence media discourse, try and influence, leak emails and do things. I mean, Russia has that capacity. But whether it affected the outcome, people don't think, who've looked at this, who insofar as they're able to talk about it, say not. It didn't. But it's something that we don't want it to be able to have the outcome in the future. So I think the U.S., the French election was a good example about how to, whatever they did, it managed to neutralize any Russian interference. And I think that those kind of defenses are going to be spread to, are spreading to other European countries and European partners like Ukraine.
Hi, thanks for coming. My question is regarding like hybrid war or sort of information war that Putin is sort of waging. And I'm a Canadian. Recently, Canada was the target of the Putin propaganda sort of machine. A Canadian politician was smeared as a fascist recently. Yeah, so it's not really just a war of like bombs and bullets. It's an information war. I would just like to know your opinion on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, I know the Canadian foreign minister has become, is very concerned about this because she's a real lover of Russia and really, wants to support Russian Democrats, but has become, now a banned person in Russia because she is so influential and knows Russia so well. Yeah, this is an area I don't have a lot of knowledge, but I can see that Ukraine really being on the front line of this kind of information campaign. And it's something that is difficult for the United States, Canada, Ukraine, and other democracies to respond to, because we're sort of, it's a problem in that how do you allow freedom of speech, freedom of discourse without allowing people to propagate, fake news, false information, autonomous attacking, and so on. It was a real challenge in the U.S. elections, not so much Russia, but just the way the whole media scene developed during the elections. It was just a lot of wild accusations that were being made, and a lot of information that previously journalists just wouldn't report because there weren't confirming sources, and you wouldn't make that kind of speculation. I think that there are the NATO, EU, Ukraine, there's like a Stop Fake News movement. I had the opportunity to talk with one of their leaders at lunch. So it seems we're building up our defenses, but as you know, some of the actions Ukraine has taken are somewhat controversial, banning Russian television, expelling a Russian journalist, and it doesn't always meet with understanding in some Western countries. But it seems to be effective, but it's something that would be really hard to do in Canada and the U.S. just because it's, there's just a different basis. Did you have any suggestions? I mean, have you seen anything work well in Canada in this? I just don't know enough about about this issue to know what's the state there.
Well, basically the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland, she was smeared as her grandfather was a Nazi collaborator, which would imply that she is now a Canadian politician who is a Nazi, which is just absurd. Basically, yeah, one solution was like a week later they just totally debunked it. But by then it was out there, and the sort of the people who are more prone to like pro-Russian views had that view. Even in Canada, they were saying that, which is so crazy because Canada's like the archetypal peacekeeper sort of thing. So
yeah.
I
guess. I mean, the one question we have is the impact of this long term. I mean, it's clearly it has a short term impact in the immediate cycle, but long term, I just don't know how much impact this is having.
Real quick. Hi, I'm Brandon. I'm an American living in Kiev. My question is, do you know specifically what has led to the closures of the Russian diplomatic missions in the United States recently?
Yeah, because the stated explanation sounded right to me. As you know, there was the U.S. had cut back on Russian diplomatic activity in the U.S., particularly at the end of the Obama administration. They closed some facilities, expelled some diplomats. It seemed to have been where some of this influence, attempt to influence elections that were taking place. And then the Russians didn't respond at the time, surprisingly. And Putin said, come to my Christmas party, you can stay in Russia. And then Trump came in and welcomed it, but then the Russians were waiting for Trump to reverse some of Obama's actions, and he didn't. And then Putin finally took a response, but it looked very extensive, cutting back the number of diplomats from 1,200 to 485 or whatever the number was, just because this was Russia's response to several waves of sanctions. And then the U.S. responded recently with some closings, but it was limited. I mean, basically, Russia had one more consulate than the U.S. has in Russia, and so they closed one of those, so the numbers are even. But they didn't cut back the number of Russian diplomats. They'll just have to move elsewhere. And Putin recently said that Russia reserves the right to respond but won't now. And so I think we're going to stop where we are. But this exchange, as has often been the case when this has occurred, it hurts Russia the most, because there are many more Russians who want to come to the U.S. than Americans who want to come to Russia. And one of the measures has been that now if you want to apply to a visa to come to the U.S., you have to go to Moscow. And so if you're in Vladivostok, you're not. I don't think you're going to do that unless it's really important. So as with many of these, reciprocal sanctions, the Russians don't really have a good way of getting back at the U.S. So sometimes they'll say, okay, well, you can't adopt any more Russian orphans, or we won't import any more EU, your cheeses from EU or something. But it doesn't. The economic stake, as we talked about earlier, is such that the U.S. it doesn't really matter to the U.S. if we cut back on trade or diplomatic exchanges. However, going forward, I don't see an easy way to repeal these sanctions, at least in the U.S. That's a problem with the sanction policy. It's really easy to enact these sanctions, but then it's really hard to reverse them. So even when we wanted to, with like North Korea earlier or Cuba, now it's just hard because it's hard to get a majority in favor of repealing. Remember Jackson-Vanik, that trade? It was impossible to get rid of because you're getting a majority to vote in favor of repeal was difficult. So there'd be some member of Senate would say, well, what about what Russia's doing here, or what about this issue? And so it's a net decrement to both our countries, but I think Russia is hurt at least initially more. I do hope it stops though, because I miss not having Russian students anymore. For example, it's partly the U.S. fault too, because we cut back on the funding programs. I used to get a lot of Russians, Ukrainians, and so on come to study in the U.S., but they cut back on the funding. So the Muskie program, we had a future president of Georgia come and study in the U.S. That's gone, at least in whatever form it was. And so I think that though it's not a current priority, hopefully we will see a renewed U.S. interest in investing in the next generation of Russians, and as well as other former Soviet republics, getting them to come to the U.S., getting to know Americans. That would help Americans understand the country region better, regenerate interest in learning these languages. But where we are now, it's just been going downhill. But I think it's stabilized. I think right now we're at a low relationship that will not go down any further, but I don't see what's going to improve it anytime soon.
Thank you for being here. My question will be following. How does the U.S. foreign policy tackles China's presence in the Middle East in the frames of One Belt, One Road initiative? Because some researchers state that U.S. is slowly stepping out of the Middle East, and China is growing its presence in the region, especially investing a lot of money in financial sphere, in oil research, and different spheres. And there is a possibility that if U.S. steps out of the Middle East, China will want to protect its investments and grow its military power. How it's possible that China will fill in the vacuum that U.S. can create in the Middle East?
Yeah. I don't see that in the Middle East yet, the U.S. withdrawing vacuum. I mean, in the campaign, there was some talk in terms of the administration wanting to cut back on some elements of the U.S. presence. And there's been a change of priorities, a bit more focus on terrorism, less focus on democracy, promotion, human rights, but not much. But, they cut off aid to Egypt recently because of human rights concerns. China has been building up its presence throughout the world, Africa, Middle East. In the Middle East, it's less visible. More visible is the Russian military activity in Syria. So far, the Chinese, it's still focused on economic presence. The Chinese are skilled. The only country I know that can balance good ties with Saudi Arabia and Iran, right, for example. But I don't see this more as it's more an economic issue. And the Obama administration position was, even in Central Asia, where I think what you said has been occurring, I do see a pullout and decline of U.S. interest in Central Asia, even with the renewed commitment to Afghanistan. I see China moving into this vacuum. And the Obama administration at least accepted this as better than the alternative, which is Russia resurgence in the region. So there was a lot of concern about the Eurasian Union, a lot of concern about Russian activities in Middle East and in Central Asia, whereas China was more open. I mean, there was no overt military agenda. It was concerned about whether this would be an open, transparent Chinese investment, how the worker, the local people would be treated. The fear was the Chinese companies would treat the local people the same way they treat Chinese workers, right? Which is really bad, at least historically at the time. But China was also seen as a very positive force it was the only country that had the resources and apparent intent to build these kind of giant infrastructure projects that Central Asia and possibly the Middle East really needs. Roads, rail networks, pipelines. The Chinese seemed to be willing to put a lot of money into that, and it was thought to be useful for everybody if they could do that. Middle East, it hasn't really been an issue, the China presence there at the moment. It's not, and I don't see a vacuum of U.S. leadership in the Middle East. So far, the U.S. it's increased its military presence. It may change after the war in Syria and Iraq are concluded, but it looks like there's going to be a long-term U.S. bases in Iraq if the Iraqi government and parliament accepts. Renewed U.S. government in Afghanistan. Certainly the Saudis and others seem more happy with the U.S. presence now than they did under Obama. There's still the Qatar dispute that needs to be sorted out, but I don't see that yet in the Middle East. I don't see a dynamic shift yet. Whereas in Central Asia, it's visible, but as I said, so far it's not been a major concern under Obama in Central Asia. And the Trump administration I haven't seen I don't know what their Central Asia policy is yet. It's not really clear yet what their goals are for the region. But I don't see China as being a major concern. They're more concerned with China as doing in Asia, actually, as a course in East Asia and maybe India and so on.
Шановні відвідувачі, ми вже майже закінчуємо наш захід. Буквально одне-два питання і так, тоді, будь ласка.
Я українською, чи готові перекладачі? За браком часу у мене до вас два питання, одне таке побажання. Чи згодні ви з моїми такими тезами, що Росію на сьогоднішній день можна словами Рейгана назвати імперією зла? Чи поділяєте ви мою думку, що Росія, передавши Північній Кореї технології і комплектуючі для створення ядерної зброї і ракетні технології, хоче втягнути Америку в конфлікт з Північною Кореєю, проти якого буде активно виступати Китай, і таким чином створить конфлікт між Сполученими Штатами і Китаєм. І моя думка, як противага тут, і те, що ви сказали, ні Радянський Союз, ні Росія ніколи не боялись НАТО. Оцінювали це утворення як потенційно сильне, з яким ні Союз, ні Росія боротися не зможе. Але ті жахи, які вони, і писк той, і вереск, який видається з Росії, це виключно для внутрішнього використання, для оправдання затрат на військових затрат і виклику ненависті до західного світу в цілому. Understand? Thank you.
Right. I assume you mean the Kremlin, not Russians. Yeah. I think it's been moving in that direction in the last few years. It's always been. I mean, it's a difficult relationship. Russia and the U.S. and China, and Russia are not formal adversaries of the U.S., but they're not allies either. There's some mixed. But it's been moving much more towards the adversary pillar in recent years. But there was a reversal. For the first few months after Trump was elected, the Russians seemed to think they had someone they could bargain with. They wanted to be nice to Trump and see what maybe concessions they could get. But now it's, unfortunately, I think whatever leverage that might have had has been reversed. This question about Russia and North Korea, it's still uncertain what happened long term. In the past, the Russia position was pretty clear. It was that they opposed North Korea having nuclear weapons and missiles because it was resulting in the U.S. building up its defenses in the region. But now, I don't know. I'm worried that we're losing that. And in Iran, too, we're able to cooperate with Russia and Iran on non-proliferation, even if we differ in other areas. But because of the Syria war, the Russian-Iranian alignments become much stronger. But as I said, I think a lot of it is related to the current leadership in Russia, and I'm hopeful that a new Russian leadership, whenever it occurs, and it might take a while, will have a different approach. That's sort of, let's leave it on an optimistic note, that whatever the differences are between Russia and the U.S., Russia and Ukraine, I'm not convinced that they're very strongly based. I think they could be changed under the right conditions, and then we can speculate on what those might be.
Thank you. I think on behalf of everyone and Institute of World Policy, I would like to thank our lecturer for brilliant presentation and for widening our perspective to Eurasia, to China. And I hope it's not your last visit to Ukraine.
Certainly I'm not going to wait 30 years to come back, so yeah.
Thank you. And this region become more interesting for Europeans and for Americans. And so everyone, I want to also thank everyone for listening and for attending this event, and I hope we will organize something very soon, something such interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.